Um, Hi, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This is the first of 3 iNACOL and 2 Revolutions webinar series on the future of educator learning. I'm Natalie Truong, a policy director with iNACOL. We also have Adam Rubin, founder and partner at 2 Revolutions, and Katherine Casey presenting today. And as we're just getting started, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box below. Share your name and where you're joining from. Can we move on to the next slide? Thank you. Yes, so as I mentioned, this is the first of 3 webinars that we will be doing. So this first webinar will be focused on envisioning the future of educator learning. I'm going to kick us off with a high-level overview of why this vision for developing educator capacity is important in student-centered learning environments and what state and federal lawmakers can do to support this transition. I'll then hand it over to Adam and Katherine, who are really going to dig into what this new professional learning model could look like. And then we're going to keep the conversation going in the next 2 webinars, focusing on implementing the future of educator learning on April 15th and reimagining credentialing and partnership with higher education on May 9th. So you can register for both events at the iNACOL website below. So a little bit about iNACOL. We are a nonprofit dedicated to transforming education to student-centered learning. We're connected to educators and school districts leading innovation in education and implementing student-centered learning practices. Additionally, the iNACOL Center for Policy, where I sit, provides technical assistance and lawmaker education to federal and state policymakers. Next slide. So if you've joined other iNACOL events before, you may be familiar with this map, but we like to show this map to highlight just how far we've moved as a nation from 2012, where only a handful of states were leading policy to advance competency-based learning, to 2018, where at least 48 states have some sort of permissive policy to enable personalized learning and competency-based education. And as our field of practice and policy expands, so does our need to support educators and education leaders to make the shift to leading in student-centered learning environments. So at the heart of our vision of a future-focused education system that is personalized and student-centered is the need to redefine student success and ask what are the knowledge, skills, and dispositions that our students need to be successful in their futures towards college, career, and civic life. From there, we need to redesign systems of assessments that to align to student learning, develop educator capacity to support student learning, and rethink accountability systems that can drive continuous improvement throughout. So transforming current K-12 education systems to student-centered learning requires building teacher capacity. Educator preparation and development systems should prepare educators with the specific knowledge and skills that they need to design and implement student-centered learning environments that can meet the need of every student. And in order to do this, policymakers need to support transformation at scale. Next slide. So in our resources, we cover ways that states can support educators and leaders to lead in personalized competency-based learning environments. At the state level, states can work with stakeholders to transform educator workforce systems to prepare leaders with the skills they need for student-centered learning by identifying clear, specific educator competencies for personalized learning environments, create multiple high-quality pathways for educator credentialing and development, develop educator professional judgment for student-centered learning, and building assessment literacy. And at the federal level, there is an opportunity to reimagine teacher preparation to incentivize the development of innovative, fully competency-based and personalized teacher preparation program. So there's an opportunity for us to launch a pilot program and the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act in order to support personalized teacher preparation programs. And we invite you to learn more, to share the work that you're advancing, and to engage with us at the iNACOL 2019 Symposium in Palm Springs. and to browse our resources on the future state of education and the federal and state policy opportunities to advance student-centered learning. As well as to tune into our upcoming publications on higher education and state policy recommendations for professional learning in student-centered learning environments that we are piloting with Katherine Casey. And with that, I will turn it over to our presenters today, Adam Rubin and Katherine Casey. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. We are excited to dig in and excited that you're all here today to talk about the future of educator learning. So, all good webinars begin with a campfire, but considering we're virtual, we will kind of touch on the essence of this work. The essence of this work is too many schools and districts have lots of the right ingredients. They have board support, they have visionary leadership, they have really dedicated, hardworking teachers. They've got communities ready for this shift, and we've seen it time and time and time again in our work. One of the things that often derails or prevents this work from going where it can go around personalized and competency-based learning is the educator learning is not mirroring the shift that we want for kids. So today and next week and in early May, we're really going to unpack different ways, different strategies, and a research base underpinning those designs. All right, I am a founder and a partner at Two Revolutions. We are a national education design lab, and my wife still doesn't know what that means, and we're in our 11th year. But what it means is we don't come with the answers. We come with different design processes and really put you as the user in your local school, district, community context to define the future of learning and then build school models, K-12 and higher ed, and really work on the systems that enable that work to scale. Our work is across 3 different areas. We really work deeply to transform school models, K-12 and higher ed. We work to help systems leaders assess themselves on the conditions that enable or inhibit those models from going to scale, and then we really work with them on the areas that are stymieing their ability to implement and scale. And then we also have increasingly an instructional design practice that grows this work. And we do our work all over the country. So it's just important for you to understand the context in which we work, which is really K-12, community, and higher ed partners. And then values. Values really ground us in this conversation, especially around professional learning. So when we talk about professional learning, we often see fragmented and incoherent adult learning. So we will usually, when thinking about professional learning, we don't think about an event. We think about the before, during, and after an event, and really a series of events. So really focused on a continuum of adult learning. That is a first order of business. Secondly, we really believe deeply that training has huge limitations. So when we do our work in a variety of different contexts, we're trying to find folks on the ground, whether instructional leaders, teacher leaders, building leaders, folks in the central office, to lock arms with us, co-lead the work, and ultimately drive the work. And then finally, another value that has emerged for us over the past decade has been too much adult learning happens in isolation. Learning is social, and learning also needs to be really anchored to felt needs. So these values really ground us in our work. Okay, the final thing I'll say by way of introduction is we could give a whole webinar on a really exciting initiative we are partnered with Chan Zuckerberg and these 11 phenomenal partners on. We have designed and launched about 6 months ago a toolbox of adult learning progressions playlists and 30 free and open educator-facing courses. And that could be the stuff of many webinars. However, on webinar number 2 next Monday, we'll dig deep into Learn Next, and it'll be a treasure trove for all of you. So at the end of this webinar, we give a URL to get into all of this great free and open educator-facing content. But we wanted to begin this webinar one step prior to the content, which is really thinking about the state of professional learning, how professional learning could be radically transformed to itself be personalized, competency-based, and deeper for educators. I am joined by a colleague, and I'm going to let Katherine introduce herself.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm excited to be here with you virtually today. When Adam and Megan asked me to briefly introduce myself, I thought a lot about where to start, and I decided to start here with this value that is a corely held value for me, and one that Adam and I think we'll try to weave throughout this presentation, which is that learning is human. And the reason I start here is because I think when you start from this place that learning is a fundamentally human activity, it kind of forces you or frees you to flip all of your assumptions about the constraints that hold us back in public education. Right? It allows you to see things that might otherwise be innovative, right? Multi-age grouping or learning happening everywhere. Those are no longer problems. They are probable. They make sense in the spirit of learning being a human endeavor. And so they become much more possible. So first, for me, this is a driver for my belief in innovation and the possibility of innovation. This also, in the context of today's conversation, sort of gives you pause and says, why do we assume that adults sort of stop learning? Why do we assume that teachers at some point plateau in their learning? If it's a fundamentally human activity, we should all be doing it all the time. I learned fairly recently of a concept in Zen Buddhism that I believe is pronounced Shoshin, but please correct me if I've mispronounced that because I'm not a native speaker, which is the beginner's mind, right? This idea that if you bring a beginner's mind to what you do, you have multiple opportunities to experience, learn, and grow. And so I share that, and I start here because I think in the context of professional learning, we really want to think about helping adults sustain their learning, sustain their curiosity, and sometimes get outside of our own expertise so that we can actually learn. Next slide, please. So briefly, my work, I'm an independent contractor, as I may or may not have mentioned already. My work falls in these 4 categories, which I think align to the idea of a human-centered model. 1, work with people, develop leaders in their capacity to guide their own practice, build their own organizations, and learn and grow. Develop community around those leaders so they can be most impactful in their work. Help those leaders develop learning, both their own learning and also places of learning for students. And then develop knowledge, right? So develop, codify, and share what we find, what we learn, so that others can follow in footsteps. And then finally, this is a piece that Natalie mentioned at the outset, this piece, Moving Toward Mastery, that I authored last year, published last fall with iNACOL and Competency Works. This paper is really the culmination of a very collaborative approach with over 100 leaders and educators from around the country who were asked the question, what is the future state of professional practice? What can teaching look like in a student-centered environment? And so what we focus on in this report is the idea that teaching can be an equity-oriented, learning-centered, and lifelong profession. There's a lot more detail underneath those 3 headings, but this is kind of an anchor for my work and my thinking around the future state of professional learning, and I'll be touching upon a lot of these ideas throughout our time today. So that'll do it for me by way of introduction. Adam, I'll pass it back over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so should have said at the beginning that a webinar format is interesting and challenging. We are going to try to push the edges of the webinar format. So I want to applaud all of you for joining and for choosing to participate in what will be a really experiential process. So, during our time, we're going to briefly touch on the limitations of our traditional model. You all know it by virtue of your association with iNACOL, by virtue of making time and space for this conversation. We're going to touch on some frameworks we've developed to really unpack transformed professional learning. And then ideally, if you and we are successful, and it really will require, we're going to put the burden on all of you as the learners, we would love to, at 3:59, have you walk away with an innovative idea that you can actually put into use in your context and start prototyping. All right, so our agenda today, we are going to start with the challenge, move to the opportunity, do some visioning work together, and then we've got a design block where you all will be doing that work together. And then in the next steps, we'll share lots of the resources. I see Megan is also putting some resources as they come up in the chat, but there's a couple of final slides that talk about the next webinars and some resources you can walk away with today. Okay, a couple of housekeeping tips. For using Zoom, and I'm not hearing any backdrop, so I assume everyone is able to mute and unmute. There's a navigation bar if you scroll to the bottom of the screen. To support collaboration when we get into breakout rooms, which I'll explain in a moment, you can turn on your video, just enables that a little bit better. And then the chat feature, and it looks like folks are having no problem chatting, which is great. So we would encourage you to chat questions, thoughts, ideas, and any needs you have during the remainder of our time together. All right. And then at 2 points in this webinar, we are going to break you out into different spaces. So this function feels like a little Star Trek, which is exciting in a virtual synchronous way. But you'll see a link and you will have 60 seconds until you're automatically moved. So please join that breakout room so you can join some other colleagues. And then you can always raise your hand for help. All right, so why does PD need to change? Well, we think you've got by virtue of being on this call, a very, very good sense of the challenge. We are asking teachers to teach in ways like they never experienced as learners. And the challenge is meaningful and significant. For those of you, and often in in-person design sessions, we'll kind of go deeper in this section. But for the purposes of this venue and for the purposes of our time together, we wanted to give you a great resource. So a colleague and I just wrote a chapter for a book on the future of educator learning that has a lot of really rich data on the brokenness and the hope, but it really anchors us in the $18 billion a year we spend as a K-12 US set of educators on professional learning. The ineffectiveness through lots of studies that is documented around the current model. And then we really lay out some different paradigms to consider. So we will put this in the chat. It will also be at the end. But you can dig deep into a lot of the data. And the data are really helpful in substantiating a need to shift, in justifying your advocacy wherever you sit in your system. So we wanted to spend some time talking about opportunities to shape the future of educator learning. So we're going to look at a set of trends. When we think about the future of learning and when we think about the future of adult learning, we really think in terms of some big trends that are shaping that. So we see kind of a fundamental evolution in technology. We see meaningful and dramatic advances in the cognitive sciences. We see the growth of an on-demand economy. We see a moving away from, toward depth and away from breadth. Put differently, content is evolving from being king to, having a place at the table with, deeper and blooms moving up looms. And then we also see a growing ecosystem of learning. So Katherine and I are going to spend a few minutes just putting a little bit of a face on some of these key trends that we see. All right, so evolving technology. Shocking data. No surprise to anybody in 2019 that technology is evolving and fundamentally shaping the future of learning and the future of educator learning. But, around the turn of the century, what was kind of e-learning evolved into online, has really taken shape around artificial intelligence, wearables, and then increasingly we're seeing an accelerated movement toward technological singularity. So that is still in the future, but the implications, we think, with $6 billion invested in 2017 in education technology has a huge footprint in our schools. And some of the implications we see for educators are increasingly tech-enabled educator learning, increasingly personalized educator learning, and much greater degrees of flexibility through micro-credentials, through much more easily accessible CEUs, graduate credits, through opportunities to team in lots of different ways. So evolving technology is one of the key trends shaping the future of educator learning. And the OER effort, the Learn Next effort that I referenced, is something that will be a very tangible giveaway for all of you on our coming webinar.
I'm going to speak a bit about the concept of an ecosystem of learning. So for a long time, school has had has had a monopoly, right, on learning. It is the place where learning happens for students, and by extension, it is the place where professional development happens for teachers. What we're seeing in the world around us, however, is that learning happens everywhere. This is driven in part by technology, as Adam has shared. This is driven in part by an expanding number of institutions that are engaging young people and students in learning. It's driven by a number of factors. So for students, right, we see this playing out in a number of ways. We've seen it for a long time in expeditionary learning and other models that seek to get students out into the world to experience learning everywhere. We're now seeing it through blended learning, through distance learning, through places, schools that operate with city as school philosophies and take students out into their urban environments to learn. It's incredibly powerful. So the question then becomes, what can that mean? What might that mean by extension for educator learning? I think it can mean a lot of things. First and foremost, it means we have to think beyond PD. I have to think beyond professional development, meaning teachers in seats in an auditorium engaging in learning, and think about how their learning can be extended into the broader world, the broader ecosystem. So a few concrete ways this might look. We can think about professional learning communities anchored around common areas of passion or common topics that happen at a distance, right, using technology. We can think about micro-credentials, as Adam has shared, which are in and of themselves assessments of learning, but they allow teachers to demonstrate learning that happens in the classroom, in the world, at conferences, wherever they go, to demonstrate that learning and have that count as part of their professional development and advancement. Sort of more maybe whimsically, you could think about it in terms of inspiration tours, inspiration walks, learning visits, things that teachers do to engage their curiosity and creativity outside of the classroom. So again, the concept here of ecosystem of learning, learning happens everywhere. We're exploring what that means for students and by extension, what that can mean for teachers. I'm also going to speak briefly to this idea that we're moving toward depth and away from breadth. So the way I think about this, right, is we're looking first at the idea that we want to sustain focus in learning over time. So oftentimes in traditional methods of learning, of professional learning, right, we'll see sort of topical one-day focuses, and a lot of them over the course of the year. So we're asking teachers to cover a lot of content with very little opportunity to practice or to sustain their learning. So first, sustained, focused learning over time. And secondly, an opportunity to specialize and to focus, right? So allowing teachers to sort of break out of the monolithic role of teacher and think about developing their own learning, their own mastery in certain areas, and to specialize in their roles accordingly. And one thing I want to say here when we think about this idea of going deep into work over time, into learning over time, opportunities for practice, and also developing specialization, is that this is not necessarily about developing expertise or mastery or arriving at a state of perfection in practice the way we often frame learning, right? I would sort of frame this around the idea of personal mastery. And to quote Peter Senge, people who have a high level of personal mastery live in a continual state of learning. They never arrive. It is a lifelong discipline. So with this idea of going deep, I think is also this idea of cycling through continued evolving stages of learning within areas of real focus and passion.
Okay, the growth of an on-demand economy. So it's even when we wrote this chapter 2 years ago now, I just think the exponential increase in on-demand economy for all of us. Like, we land in a city, we order a Lyft or an Uber, we book all our tickets. Everything we do outside of our jobs is increasingly leveraging on-demand services, on-demand resources. That is beginning to rear its head in K-12 increasingly. I think MOOCs, a growing kind of set of on-demand expertise, curriculum, lesson planning, really student and teacher-facing content and an array of supports. And then we're also seeing a growth curve around assessment tools and resources are increasingly on demand, and we're seeing the development of free and freemium. So lots of this content and lots of these services are free, and then there are opportunities to really deepen the services, MOOCs being a great example. The content is free, but facilitation and validation of that learning increasingly is something that people charge for. So, when we think about redesigning educator learning, we need to pay attention to and leverage the opportunity that exists through the on-demand economy.
Advances in cognitive science are incredible and are certainly shaping how we think about all learning, student learning, and also adult learning. There's a lot that could be said here, so I will try to drill into a couple of ideas that I think are key. One, we are learning a lot about what you could call the learning sciences and how they affect how people learn best, or what they tell us about how people learn best. So when we think about kids or adults, we now know more so than ever before that we absolutely have to be thinking about motivation, about emotional as well as intellectual engagement, about the sense of belonging, right, as actually a critical enabler of learning. What does that mean? Belonging for adults as an enabler of learning. We have to think about short and long-term memory, right? So again, when we're phasing out adult learning in sort of snippets that are disconnected, we are not allowing them to build on prior knowledge, and that is critical. And again, as Adam has mentioned, we've got to think about learning is social. That's what what studies of the brain tell us. We have to think about how we engage adults in learning that is social. So number one, really, really looking for ways to connect how adults learn with what we know about the way the brain works. Number two, neurodiversity. So we are learning more about all of the multitude of ways that people's brains differ, right? So I won't use the language of learning styles, but I do think it's important for us to recognize that brains are built and operate in many different ways. We are all somewhere along many spectra of how our brains operate. And so we've got to think about learning experiences for adults that accommodate those different learning preferences and different ways of brain function. And then finally, plasticity, right? So we are, again, learning much more about brain plasticity. And I would sort of harken back to something I said a while ago, which is we've sort of assumed and taken it for granted that at some point teachers plateau in their learning, right? They get better over the first 3 to 5 years when they go from being a novice teacher to a sort of functional teacher, and then the learning plateaus. But there's nothing in the brain science that tells us that that is normal, right? In fact, we are always able to shift and to learn and to grow. And our brains are able to change their very structure to accommodate and drive that learning. So as we think about the learning sciences, about neurodiversity, and about plasticity, this really can help frame the way we think about the learning process and experience for adults, for teachers, about differentiation, individualization, accommodation of differences, and also about continuous learning, no matter how long a teacher's in the classroom.
So paying attention to all these shifts is really, it's important and relevant to understand that our schools are happening in a context of a fundamentally shifting world. Student learning is happening in that context, and so is educator learning. So really we just distilled down 5 mega trends for future of learning into kind of a jumping off point for how we might think differently about adult learning. So what could the future of educator learning look like? I am shocked and amazed, as I'm sure lots of you are, that we spend a lot of time as a field talking about the minutia, usually management-related issues, occasionally instruction and assessment, but we don't often have the luxury of stepping back. So I want to invite all of you to have that luxury for the next couple of minutes and step back and think about learning. So let's see if the technology gods are with us, which hopefully they will be. I want to introduce you to a little girl.
I first started.
This little girl is named Adeline, and this little girl is going to tell us how she learned how to dubstep.
About 7-8 months ago. It all began from a report for Michael Jackson, and I went on the internet and I fell upon dancing to dubstep, and I just started practicing and going on from there. I just go on YouTube, look up random stuff like how to dubstep or how to pop and lock, and to learn the move, I usually watch the video over and over and over. I probably watched like millions until I figure out how they do it. Sometimes you can transfer one move to another, like you just go with the flow, and it's kind of weird because I'm just like in my la la land. If you're on the internet, you can really learn and teach yourself. It benefits you by rewinding, pausing, doing all that stuff because you can watch it over and over again, but in a classroom, you can't do that. Honestly, because I've learned this whole thing from the internet, and the internet is my generation to learning these things. I think I can show people that you can do anything if you really have a passion for it.
Okay, so thank you, Adeline. If we had some more time, and we have been doing this with state boards of education, we've been doing it with boards of education, superintendents, C teams, we've been doing it at building levels for the past couple of years using a video like this or other different learning videos as a way to anchor this conversation in how do you learn? So I'd encourage you in the chat, and I see a few of you already doing that, just to kind of, what's a skill you recently learned and what process did you use to learn it? This is a really, really rich generative exercise, in whatever context you're doing your work, to anchor the conversation around learning, in this context as a way to fundamentally rethink adult learning. So I want to kind of give you a thesis and then give you your charge, which will be for the last 15, 18 minutes to do some design work yourselves. one of the things that we are playing with as an organization is this continuum from pedagogy to andragogy to hudagogy. Pedagogy is the teaching of students. Andragogy is the teaching of adults or adult learning theory. And this idea of, if you look at these columns and you think about the concept of the learner, the role of the learner's experience, the readiness to learn, orientation to learning, and the motivation around learning, it's different for our students and our educators. And just thinking about a table like this is Tony Knowles. He's kind of a lead thinker around adult learning theory from the 80s and 90s. And this table is a really succinct way to capture this idea of honoring our professionals, creating environments that are increasingly self-directed and that really build from our educators' skills and assets, and have them as professionals really think through where they have gaps and drill down on those gaps. So this framework caused us and supported us to think through a different way of thinking about educator learning. So traditional professional learning really begins far too often with the content. What are we going to cover today in this in-service session? What are we going to be doing during pre-service? And it's the subject. The process that we often use, unfortunately, and you and I see it in far too many places, is we're talking at our educators, we're talking down to our educators, but we're using a process and we're not really investing in thinking about the process. So we're leading with content using whatever process, and the mindset all too often is really a compliance orientation. It's, will I be evaluated on this? Will this too pass? Will this be an initiative of the initiative Christmas tree of ornaments that we have in our district or our state? One of the things that we're thinking on is a different approach to this work, where you all lead with process. So whatever process you lead with, you're much more intentional thinking through the process of this work. You're really focused in, the plasticity and the sense of the mindsets that Katherine was alluding to. Like, we really want to tune in. We don't want to, we need to tune into our educators' hearts and minds, using process to open them up to deliver the content, whatever the content is. In our work, at least, we have been wildly more successful when we have reached those educators on a more human and more respectful level, making them open to the content around designing a performance assessment, or the what, the why, and the how of learner agency, or a competency-based structure looks like X, Y, and Z. So the thesis is really shifting from content process mindset to leading with process, opening up mindsets to get to content. So what we are going to do now has not been done before in this webinar. So you are all in the brave new world of breakout rooms. We're going to challenge you all to design an innovative professional learning session. So it's going to be a little messy, but we're excited, and you'll get a chance to meet with and work with some of your colleagues on this call. Your task is going to be to prototype a professional learning session with other webinar participants. You'll have a packet with your scenario, and I'll give you the URL for your packet in 1 second. And your packet's going to introduce you to a scenario. You're going to have mindsets, content, and you're going to choose the process that will activate the learning for your educators. And then you'll share back a couple minutes before the hour a headline for your plan in the chat box. All right, so this is the URL. So I'm imagining it's already in the chat. There it is.
It is, yes. Please open it before you move to breakout rooms.
All right. Is there any other instructions I need to give folks? And maybe what we'll do in light of where we are time-wise is maybe invite people back at 53 or 54.
Sounds good. No, I think we're all good. So you'll see a box come up in just a moment that's inviting you to join a breakout room. click on that link. If you are a phone participant, you'll be staying in the main room. All right, so feel free to flag if you're having any troubles joining a breakout room. If you're joining by phone and you don't have the ability to join a breakout room, we sent an email to you a little earlier today that has the deck. So it has the link to these instructions if you want to do that as a solo activity. And it looks like we have Dorothy here who is not assigned to a breakout room. So Dorothy, I'm going to assign you to a breakout room in case you want to join. And Stephanie, you should be seeing an invitation to join breakout room 14 if you'd like to. All right, sorry about that, Stephanie. Let me resend. And Adam, I'm seeing a request for help in breakout room 5, so I might just hop in there quickly to make sure they're okay.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay. Bonita, you should see an invite to join breakout room 3.
I don't see anything yet.
Okay. If you might need to click through, sometimes the window disappears.
I can go to the blog until everyone comes back. I mean, it's perfectly fine too.
Okay, sorry about that. Why don't I share the link so you can go through the activity and just kind of think through on your own. I think there's issues with Zoom reassigning breakout rooms. It seems like the pop-ups haven't been coming up for people, so I'm sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay.
Adam, about 3 minutes?
I think that'd be great. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. I'll let them know they've got about 3 minutes left.
Okay.
All right, and I'm going to close rooms, and then it'll be about 60 seconds until everyone joins back.
That sounds great.
Understanding the different ways.
All right, looks like everyone's back, and we're seeing the headlines come in.
All right. Any final headlines? We'd love to see them that are emerged from your conversation. I also wanted to put in the chat. So this was a game that we built and then formed a partnership after we built it with the MIT Teaching and Learning Lab to kind of take it to the next level. So this game is available on the LearnNext site. Once you go in and register on the LearnNext site, you just type in the search bar, which PD would you attend? And then there's an online version of it that's kind of software. And then there's also the downloadable and printable cards. And our team really kind of developed a set of scenarios, probably 7 or 8 scenarios. And then there are a set of process cards, a set of mindset cards, a set of content cards to really create a learning experience for senior teams, for professional development teams, for whole staffs we've run it with. So the cards are great, the online version is great, but also wanted to remember just to kind of give you that link should that have been helpful, and hopefully it was. As a way to kind of really begin to get into the design side of leveraging this logic of process and mindset as drivers for your professional learning. All right, so what are you going to do next? One of the things is on April 15th at the same time, 3 o'clock, we are going to implement the future of educator learning. So during that session, we're really going to go deep into Learn Next. So the URL is right there, and I imagine it'll go right in the chat. That's a free online registration to Learn Next, which again is this library co-created by 11 national partners of adult learning progressions, playlists, courses, to really kind of have the content side, take the guesswork out and have the content side of next-gen personalized competency-based learning really taken care of. High-quality playlists, high-quality courses for you to kind of deploy in your context. And then we're going to have a couple of grantees from a Rethink PD grant program who will really speak deeply to the work that's happening in their contexts. On May 9th, I will be with another team member from Two Revolutions and one of the deans from Southern New Hampshire University. Two Revolutions in Southern New Hampshire is partnering, and we have launched a master's and a CAGS in leading and learning in a competency-based model. So it's a really rich experience. We're really trying to walk the talk and model competency-based and personalized for all of our participants, teacher leaders and building leaders and systems leaders. So if you're interested in kind of thinking differently about credentialing in partnership with higher ed, that will be a great session for you to attend. And we'll put the link for registration in the chat. Three pieces that we referenced during this webinar. So Katherine's work in partnership with Competency Works and iNACOL, Moving Toward Mastery, is a really, really rich piece. I was just telling her this morning. Our team has digested it and really infused it in lots of our work. Really, really rich piece. Natalie, at the beginning of the call, mentioned an iNACOL piece on developing a modern teacher workforce. And then I referenced briefly a chapter we have in a free downloadable book put out by Paul Grave and Macmillan on the future of educator learning. So those are three resources that are takeaways from our webinar. And then we would love for you all to post in the chat one takeaway, one action step, or one question that came up for you during the sit and get or during the kind of roll up your sleeves and do portion of this conversation. And while you are putting those in the chat, Katherine and I would love to hear from you with any questions, thoughts, ideas. So I just posted our email addresses. And thank you all very, very much. We enjoyed the conversation. Hope you did.